In this part, Professor Achdut from the program on economics and society will present regarding Israel's budget, regarding concrete aspects, and the responder will be Shmuel Abramson from the National Council for Economics. So we can have a discussion and some questions before we move on to the second part, which is the panel discussion, where we can once again hear from Professor Kolias. Good day. My lecture will have two parts. In the first part, I will give a perspective of the first 2 decades regarding the development of public expenditures and the matter of priorities. I will relate to Israel's place with an international comparison in a perspective of time as well. And I will try to present an analysis of long-term connections between a number of areas that the government is involved in, compared with variables that are quite reminiscent of what we just heard in the area of the variables that can explain development in expenditures over time. In the second part, I will present our program for the 2017 to 2019 budget in comparison to the budget that results from the government policies and the existing fiscal rules. So we'll begin with the size of the abroad government with the perspective of the past 2 decades. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with this. We can see that from the mid-1990s up to the present, that is the past 2 decades, the expenditures of the broad government diminished from 50% of the product to 30% of the product, or rather 39%, 11 points. And income diminished from taxes on a scale of 4% of the product, from 34 to 30. And also other income have seen a considerable reduction. So we find ourselves, what this slide shows us is that the involvement of the government has decreased. And if we look now at the comparison of the first decade of 1996 to 2005 and the last decade, 2005 to 2015, if we compare the average of these 2 decades, we see that the government expenditures have gone down by 6.8% of the product, and we can see where this decrease occurred. 2% of the product are in the financing area, interest payments, 1.6 in defense budget, and in welfare and housing, education and health. In other words, it covers more or less all the budget items, although there are some budget items where the reduction was sharper than in other areas. And what was the money that became available used for? So we see that part was used to reduce taxes, 3.1%. At the same time, the other income or revenues also decreased, and so we were able to reduce the deficit by 1.1% of the product between these 2 decades on the average, of course. We can also see, compared to the OECD, the expenditures of the broad government when more or less up until the financial crisis of 2008, Israel spent more, but during this period there was also a very sharp decrease, far greater than that was characteristic of the OECD companies in the size of the expenditure. From 2008, we continued to go down in government expenditures, although to a much more moderate level than in the first half of the 2000s. And the OECD countries, in fact, there we see a rather steep rise in expenditures, which continues to this day. And of course, the gap today between Israel and the average in the OECD is about 6% of the product. If we look at the civil expenditures without interest of the government, we can see the expansion of the gap, the increase in the gap. In the early 2000s, it was on a scale of about 4% of the product, and it expanded to about 10% of the product. We can also see in a comparison between Israel and the OECD, in an average of these 2 decades, if the OECD countries, if the expenditures grew between these 2 decades by 2.4% of the product, in Israel it went down by 3.2% of the product. And in the OECD countries, this addition was designated mainly for social protection, welfare, and health expenditures, jobs, and so on. The question that we're asking now regarding this development in the expenditures is, does this coincide with the needs of a society in Israel? And we tried to examine this question from a number of different angles, and one of them was from an econometric perspective regarding the long-term links between expenditures and a series of explanatory variables which we think are relevant. We did this examination using a regression of co-integration for 4 areas where the government is involved: defense, health, education, and welfare. We will not get into the details of the technique or the outcomes of the equations for lack of time, but I'd just like to say that we used explanatory variables like the product or product per capita, depending on what area we're talking about. We talked about the proportion of certain populations, for example, the elderly, when it's because that's relevant to the health system and the welfare system, single-parent families, and their proportion of the population is important for subjects related to welfare. We talked about, for example, expenses on R&D, which we consider important to the development in health and technology, and we know that technology is an accelerator of health expenses, and there are many variables that we, in fact, tried to explain using the connection and the long-term development of the expenditure.
And what we did, basically, was that most of these variables reflect needs, not all of them. And by means of these results, we evaluated the expenditure that is expenses by needs, and we compared it to the expenditure de facto. And let's just see the final results of those gaps between the anticipated expenditure and the expenditure de facto in 4 different areas that were studied and researched by ourselves. So in all these topics or areas, we have, again, a shortage expectations versus needs. You could see in terms of, again, in terms of the allies, in terms of the enemies, there is that discrepancy here. Let's see what else. But what we wanted to show you was what actually, some of these variables show needs. We wanted to see an overall direction of what actually explains the expense vis-a-vis consumption. There is no reason that what was enough in the past would be enough for the future. There are many variables that are also relevant for future explanation as well. And we also have these sort of gaps or shortages in percentages as well. And we also translated this gap or this discrepancy to sums of billions of shekels, again, using cost from 2014, which gives us a more overall picture regarding the development of the expenditure. And let's go back again to, and we see where Israel stands in the OECD scales. And let's see that, on average, the OECD countries spend more on all the different areas of social protection, except for those with physical disabilities or any type of disabilities. And of course, these gaps can't only be explained by the generosity of the system, but also because of the demographic structure. And that is why when we make this comparison, we have to, get rid of differences that are related to demography. Let me give you 2 examples on how we did it in the education system, for example, where we can actually see the public expenditure per student and see how this compares between Israel and the OECD. And in primary school or high school education, we found 30% less. And also in the expenditure on post-high school studies, we actually spend 30% less than the OECD countries. Then we can also compare the expenditure per capita, the public expenditure per capita, when, again, we once again make the correction when we talk about the demographic situation. No, not long ago, we actually published a paper that shows how the sort of amendment in accordance with demography changes our ranking on the OECD scale when we talk about the health services or health expenditure. So we factored in that correction, the demographic correction. We took into account in the needs between the different age groups, and we see that here as well, there is still a big discrepancy between Israel and the OECD average, which is actually increasing with time, as you can see before you. And of course, when we talk about the welfare system and other support systems, we actually discover that in a long-term perspective, our social policy or economic policy will actually we see the gaps have become wider in terms of the poverty. I think what this slide shows you is that we have not been able to exploit the decrease in that economic inequality in order to achieve a decrease in the available income inequality. It is true in the past 2 or 3 years there is some sort of improvement that we have seen, and yet when we compare ourselves to other developed countries, we are almost top of the scale that on the scale of inequality in available income. We can see this in the rate of poverty as well, and you can see where Israel is ranked. One of the countries, where the rate of poverty is the highest, 18%, even more, in comparison to the 11% of the OECD countries. And of course, we can see the direct correlation between civil expenditure and the government contribution to decreasing poverty. Israel is characterized with a small civil expenditure. And again, we don't have much ability to decrease or diminish that poverty. We are only 25% successful. Again, after payment is transferred to the various sectors. So can we actually say that in light of the development that we have seen over 2 decades, in light of the social situation today, can we, how would I say it, can we take or can we tolerate a moderate increase in public expenditure? Or again, cut in other sectors? I think what this slide shows us is that, again, this has been updated by Ministry of Finances regarding the adjustments that are needed in comparison to other years between 2017 to 2019, what cuts would be needed in light of the fact that the government committed to have much higher expenditure, to spend much more than what our fiscal situation allows us, what the Ministry of Finance allows. So there are 2 different possibilities. One is to cut in if expenses at the moment, or not to be on par, or not to live up to those resolutions taken. So the question is, can we indeed today, are we able to cut expenditure on the scale that we are talking about? We are talking about cumulative amounts, of course, so that in 2019, the overall commitments will be around 15 billion shekels. And our answer is no. And that is why we are offering an outline which is a little different, again, emanating from the fiscal rules. And let me say what we would like to achieve at the outset. By means of the outline that we are proposing, because again, public expenditure again will come up from 40% or so. That's basically the assessment for 2006, and to go up to 41.3% of the GDP. When again, according to the current law, says that again maybe the expenditure will drop a little. That is what the current law says. So how can we achieve such a result? Okay, we're talking about overall expenditure of the government. So what we would like to see is to see again what our proposal is regarding the expenditure and deficit, of course. So the overall sum of the expenditure, government expenditure, the government is allowed to again increase that expenditure by 1.16% in realistic terms. This is basically a rate that again has been around for some time. Just to remind you, the overall expenditure, current expenditure, government expenditure, actually sets a target of 50% of product of GDP. That is the aspiration. And so long as we are not there, the expenditure will keep growing, again, with that relation of 50, of again, debt and product of 50% in relation to, of course, growth in population. So this gives us the 2.6, 2.7 that I mentioned. We are proposing to increase the overall expenditure and to increase it by 4% in realistic terms. We think that the anticipated for 2017 to 2.75, to increase that to 2.75. We think that is a little too dramatic. We would like to mitigate the decrease sorry, we propose again to mitigate that decrease, not to 2.5, but to set it at 2.75, and then to bring it down by 0.25 in 2018, and then in 2019 as well. It is clear, into the microphone, please, thank you. Of course, it is clear that this connection or this combination of bringing up expenditure above the ceiling and the fact that we mitigate, again, the decrease in deficit forces us to find other sources. And these sources, by means of increasing taxes, and we actually calculated the increase in taxes that is needed in each one of the 3 coming years, in accordance with a government policy and in accordance with the proposals of the Van Leer proposal. And every year, we would need to impose taxes on about 3 billion in 2000, 73 billion shekels or so. In 2018, it's cumulative, of course. There will be an addition beyond the 3 billion. All in all, the decrease in taxes that, again, will be accumulated in 2019 will be 19 billion shekels. We can also compare that debt-product ratio in using fiscal tools. We can see that, again, with the debt product ratio goes down from 6.6% of product to 6.35%. If we talk about a government policy, it's a moderate decline. And in accordance with the Van Leer proposal, there is a moderate increase. We would also like to say that this combination of a bigger expenditure and also higher taxes in the Van Leer proposal versus government policy also tells us that we have a forecast for the product development, which is a little different. And the gap in the increase of product between those 2 scenarios, one of the government scenario is in comparison to the Van Leer proposal, in 2090 it can reach to 0.7. And again, we've used evaluations or assessments of a balance with an exponent of 0.4. And we had some discussions in the past and in this place as well. Multiplier 0.4, and the multiplier, whether it's 0 or not, it's also open to discussion. Civil expenditure, of course, according to our proposal, we can increase that from 20% today to 21.3% of the product. And again, based on the government policy, we basically remain on the same scale of 20% or so. And we can also show you that when we compare the overture of expenditure, again, the Van Leer proposal, compared to the government policy, we can actually bring up civil expenditure with a cumulative sum that reaches 15 billion shekels. And of course, we have some other ideas what to do with this additional expenditure, or if we bring it up by 4%. And we would also like to rely on government resolutions. We don't want to invent new things. I think the needs are known, and we propose to allocate those additional sources that the government will have to allocate it for work grants, and again the whole plan of negative income tax. There was again a resolution that has not yet been legislated when relating to again single parent families. And of course, this can be expanded to families, again, with families with married couples as well. And we would also implement the plan for additional insurance and complement insurance for those who work and those who don't. These are two different plans. One is just for working people. And again, the work grant or negative income tax gives subsidies to those who do work. And it relates to families with children and employees that are 50 years and older. And the whole complementary insurance plan is basically exercised by national insurance, and it is a plan that basically ensures a minimum wage or support to those families who are not able to have any income. Some of them work at a minimum wage, some for various reasons don't work at all. And mainly we would like to deal with that population that is called a population that cannot be placed, as it is termed in Hebrew, and that cannot receive more support as a result. And of course, there are other projects as well, both in terms of support in rent. It's underway. We still have not completed these plans. In terms of health expenditure, I think not much has been done, although steps have been taken in 2016. But there are various recommendations of the Gomen committee. The government did not accept these yet. There are various recommendations that relate to many different fields, including psychiatric hospitals, and updating the health basket, and having less out-of-pocket expenditure for those insured under the health system. And there are other plans that still need further resources in order to be implemented. Some of them have been implemented, whether in full or partially. And of course, what we've been talking of lately, of increasing or enhancing the productivity per worker. So again, not only in the education system, and not only in terms of core curriculum for the ultra-Orthodox, but to improve professional training. I think you saw in one of the first slides, in comparison to the OECD, and in light of the fact that the productivity in Israel is relatively low in comparison to the OECD average, we are required to expand what we call active policy in the labor market. So where will these resources come from? I know that I'm saying things that maybe should not be said, and yet we still say them. So I would like to say the following, that you must not be wary that we are not part of the mainstream, of the prevalent opinions. But I remember about this plan when that over to the expenditure actually increased by 1%. Realistically, we warned. We warn people that this does not allow an increase in the quality of life per capita. And then when they expanded to 3%, or was it 3.2%, again by means of the previous rule, this was a very prolonged process through which things were said, and at the end of the day, they had an impact. So I think, yesterday there was a radio show about the social protest, what it did. So I believe that we must say that there are a lot of needs. There is poverty, there's distress. We have to increase expenditure, and we have to redivide or reallocate, income in the economy. I think the two ways of doing this is, first of all, to increase expenditure because the weakened population enjoy public expenditure more, relatively speaking, and we have to fund this by means of taxes. Because those who are more well-to-do pay more taxes, and then we can somehow maybe create a situation, better social situation, and this increase in expenditure is also very important for growth. It is important for growth because a better society, a more educated society, a healthier society is very important for growth. And no, not less than other areas that are usually talked of. And that is why we've given some sort of a combination here that reflects undoubtedly our perception here, our worldview of, again, taxes that can improve this allocation of income that are just. A just allocation. We might think that the combination here is a little different, but it's okay. I, for example, believe that as far as benefits for pension funds and others, we can do so much more. We can be so much more creative. Okay, but these are the sources. They're only legitimate. And all those bodies that believe that we do have to increase expenditure must continue to say so unequivocally, that there is a need to increase taxes. Again, I can't imagine that that there'll be a decrease in taxes, but we might be surprised. And why is it so important to us that why is it so important to deal with taxes progressively? Because with the fact that the tax yoke or burden has come down, so has the progression of taxes. Not only because of the weight of direct and indirect taxes, but in light of the fact that the minute that you bring down a progressive tax, you basically decrease the whole progressive quality of all the taxes. So if you see an index, progressive index, it's called the SUTS index. And this index basically tells us to what extent do we deviate from relative tax. And this, again, this is the scale between 1 and -1. 1 is a progressive tax, and we see that overall, our tax system, or our progressive index, is relatively low, 0.1, and it's on the decrease as well. But in order to make a little more tangible, that again, we want to, of course, to bring up expenditure. We also want to know which taxes to bring up or which taxes not to decrease. We also carried out a study that basically says as follows: who enjoyed the decrease in taxes last year for 4.5 billion shekels, and who enjoyed the corporate tax, and the decrease was about 1.2 billion shekels all in all. And we believe that it didn't really help assist in the progressive nature of taxes, nor did it help in that available income and for it to be more just. So thank you. And in the appendix to the presentation, you have all the models that we used and how we have assessed all the different variables and what impact they had on income in the different areas, and it will be on our site. And I would also like to say that this study was done jointly by all the members of the program, of VA Michelle, and two research assistants that are very dear to us, Gal Ben Chorin and Avishai Green, and thank you to them as well.